Hi, honey. It's sure good to hear your voice. I wish I was in Paris with you. It sounds like you're right next to...
We didn't always have communications. Once upon a time, in a world just beginning, communication didn't exist. About 2 million years ago, our ancestors were just beginning to control their environment, use fire, create tools, and develop primitive languages. For hundreds of thousands of years, progress was slow. We have only sketchy evidence of the different stages of man's increasing control over the environment, a few primitive tools, cave paintings, and fragments of sculpture. These feeble attempts to communicate are all that remain. Before 10,000 BC, transmission of messages was limited to how far man could see or hear. For thousands of years, long-distance communications were limited to how far man and his horse could run or sail his ships. It could take months, even years, to send and receive messages to distant places. Some of the signaling devices developed during this period were rather sophisticated and were used for centuries. Fire, smoke, drums, various types of visual semaphores were all used, some into the middle of the 18th century. No knowledge of electricity existed, much less the telephone. Carrier pigeons, first used by the Greeks, were still being used to carry messages for the U.S. Army in 1960. To test his theory of static electricity, the Abbey Knoll arranged 200 monks holding hands in a mile-long circle. An electrical shock was then passed to the monks at each end with a Leyden jar. All 200 monks jumped simultaneously. This practical experiment illustrated that electricity traveled instantaneously. Fortunately, there were more serious investigations and experiments being conducted during this time. Men like Franklin, Volta, Ampere, Oersted, Faraday, Wheatstone, Cook, and Morse contributed to the growing understanding and possible uses of electricity. Charles Wheatstone's telegraph was the first practical use of electricity for sending and receiving messages. Samuel Morse improved upon the idea by developing better equipment and a practical code. In 1844, his first line between Washington and Baltimore went into service. 3 years after Morse sent his historic message, "What Hath God Wrought?" from Washington to Baltimore, an individual was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, whose life would change the world. Bell grew up deeply involved in the study of speech. His father and grandfather both taught elocution, wrote and published books. His father, Melville, invented a system of visible speech symbols by which he was able to teach deaf people to talk. After both of Bell's brothers died of tuberculosis and Alexander himself was threatened, the family moved from the cold, damp climate of England to America, where they settled in Brantford, Ontario. Bell's continued interest in electricity led him to try to find a way to send several messages over a single telegraph wire simultaneously. Alexander substituted for his father at the Boston School for the Deaf. Thomas Sanders, leather merchant, and Gardner Hubbard, eminent Boston lawyer, fathers of 2 deaf children, became interested in Bell's experiments and the commercial applications of the harmonic telegraph. Hubbard and Sanders offered financial help in return for a share of the profits from any patents that might result. Bell agreed, and the three formed the Bell Patent Association. Bell moved his experiments to the Boston electrical shop of Charles Williams, where young Tom Watson was assigned to assist in his work. In the attic of the Williams shop, in separate rooms, Bell and Watson continued their experiments, their instruments connected by thin wires. Watson turned an adjustment screw so tightly that the reed stuck. Attempting to free it, he plucked it with his finger. Miraculously, the sound was transmitted to Bell in the other room. This was Bell's first telephone. With this breakthrough, Bell sketched a new device. Watson immediately set out to make it. The new instrument consisted of a diaphragm with a wire attached and suspended in a small metal cup of diluted sulfuric acid, connected through a battery to a receiver in the next room. Bell and Watson continued refining this liquid transmitter through the remainder of 1875. On February 14, 1876, a patent was filed, just 3 hours before Elisha Gray filed a caveat for a similar device. Bell's patent was issued on March 7, 1876. 3 days later, Bell dropped a liquid transmitter, spilling acid on his clothes. He called out, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," the first words ever transmitted by electricity. The first two-way telephone call was set up between Boston and Cambridgeport using private telegraph lines. Improved phones worked well on the telegraph lines between Boston and Salem. Bell and Watson managed to transmit an intelligible message from Boston to North Conway, New Hampshire. Bell and Watson were also busy giving public demonstrations of the telephone in an act resembling a vaudeville show. The first telephone company was organized, the Bell Telephone Company. Hubbard organized and licensed companies. Watson kept the lines working by developing new apparatus as needed. R.W. Devonshire, hired as a bookkeeper, was the first of nearly 1 million people ultimately employed by the Bell system. Hubbard, discouraged by the lack of return on their investment, offered to sell all the Bell patents to the powerful and rich Western Union Company for just $100,000. The offer was contemptuously refused. Desperate for money, Sanders interested a group of Massachusetts and Rhode Island businessmen who agreed to put up money in return for telephone service in the New England area. The New England Telephone Company was formed. Western Union, seeing its error in not buying Bell's patent, commissioned Edison to build a better telephone and started selling its own telephones. Hubbard hired Theodore Vail as general manager, organizer, and promoter of the newly organized Bell Telephone Company. Led by Vail, the tiny Bell organization filed suit against the giant Western Union Telegraph Company to protect Bell's patents against infringements by Edison and Gray's apparatus used by Western Union. Western Union eventually withdrew and sold all its telephones to Bell. From 1878 to 1887, under Vail's leadership, the basis of today's telephone system was established. Vail resigned in 1887 over controversy with the president of American Bell and Boston financiers, who considered dividends far more important than putting money back into building the company. Everyone looked at the telephone business as a money machine, and like vultures, they waited for Bell's patents to expire. A nationwide service and manufacturing complex was rapidly being put together, for Bell's 2 patents would expire in 1893 and 1894. In the 6 years that followed, 6,000 companies were established with no common telephone bonds or connection. In some cities and towns, you had to have several phones in order to reach different people through different companies. The company lagged technically. After a 20-year absence, bankers summoned Vail back to save the company from financial ruin. Vail prodded and supported his technical people in searching for technical solutions that expansion demanded. Within 10 years, Vail had reestablished the company as the world's communications leader through his efforts and the efforts of thousands of telephone people. During the decade from 1907 to 1917, the transcontinental line was completed. The development of the vacuum tube amplifier made this possible. Voice signals were transmitted across the Atlantic by radio telephones, dial telephones, and automatic switchboards were introduced. The company grew and prospered. The 20s were exciting times. Lindbergh, G-Men, stock market, prohibition occupied the public's mind. The Bell system, meanwhile, was developing radio, talking pictures, television, and transoceanic communications. Automatic switching systems built by Western Electric rapidly replaced manual offices. By 1960, the switched network was the Bell system's principal fiscal resource, producing 95% of its total revenues. The Depression years brought hardships to everyone. Loads on switching and transmission systems increased as the country geared up for war. Shortages of materials prevented expansion except for the war effort. 68,000 employees were in the military services. Telephone growth virtually stopped. However, wartime developments paved the way for future growth. Telephone people could now concentrate on improving peacetime communications. The scientific and technological innovations created by the people of the Bell system have had a dramatic effect, not only on the communications industry, but on the business and social community as well. Improved vacuum tubes, coaxial cable, microwave transmission, and switching techniques increased transmission capabilities 1,000-fold. In 1947, the transistor was invented and started a multi-billion-dollar industry. Many of today's corporate giants producing computers and microelectronics did not exist prior to the invention of this device. Lasers, solar batteries, light guides, microprocessors, all developed by people of the Bell system, enable us to communicate with each other easier and faster. Today, the communications industry remains in the forefront of technological development. The first transatlantic telephone cable crossed the Atlantic in 1956, 90 years after the first telegraph cable was laid. Telephone cable systems now connect all the continents. Rocketry development in the early 60s made it possible to orbit communication satellites. The Bell system initiated this effort, and a whole new global communication system was developed for instant transmission of voice, data, and TV signals. During the years to come, new inventions and discoveries will be added to the electronic marvels that are already taken for granted. As the communications system has grown in size and complexity, the original spirit of service remains. Since 1876, when Watson ran to assist Bell, telephone people have been going to the aid of others in emergencies, while performing their duties of keeping the communication network operating under difficult conditions. The Vail Award for Acts of Heroism in Public Service has gone to over 2,000 people since the first award in 1920. The Telephone Pioneers of America, the largest organization of its kind in the world, 200,000 active and retired members, participate in a growing program of fellowship, social, hobby, historical, and community service activities in keeping with their creed of fellowship, loyalty, service. The communications industry remains a human organization dealing with human problems. This all started with one man, Alexander Graham Bell, and continued with Watson, Hubbard, Sanders, Vail, and soon followed with thousands of men and women devoting their time and talents to this great industry. In 1983, the Bell Companies were the second largest employer in the United States. Today, we have half again as many telephones as we do automobiles, and by upcoming communications prospects, that ratio will probably grow. People from all walks of life, physicists, engineers, installers, operators, assembly workers, office workers, construction workers, and astronauts, are all part of this great industry, solving problems and working on creating a world still unknown to us. Hello.
Hi, honey. What's happening on Nebula 3? Gee, you sound as if you're right next door.